Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's start the session for the sake of the people who are on time and are joining us. My name is NC Arfani, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar titled Iran at Crossroads: Crisis, Continuity, and Transformative Change in Islamic Republic. Let me begin with a brief personal note. I'm originally from Iran and my academic background is in physics, which looks really weird, moderating a session about political issues. But however, over the time, my work has increasingly focused on issues of the academic freedom, the protection of the scholars at risk, and a border relation between the knowledge, power, and political constraints. This engagement is deeply personal to me because of the political acts that I have done against Islamic regime. I am now living in exile. It reflects not only my professional trajectory, but also my connection to the lived realities of the students, scholars, and intellectuals in contexts where the freedom of think, teach, and express ideas is limited. I have been honored to receive the Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2025 for the activities that I have done regarding academic freedom in case of the Iran and also worldwide. Before I continue, I would also like to express our sincere gratitude to the European Consortium for Political Research for making us available to have such kind of the webinars and the series possible to providing us with the important platform. This event is part of the broader webinar series that was originally designed to focus on academic freedom in the Middle East and North Africa, MENA. While today's session is dedicated to Iran, the three upcoming webinars in this series will be address key themes, including academic freedom, open science, and gender issue in the higher education across the MENA region. However, given the rapidly evolving situation in Iran and rising tensions across the Gulf region, we felt it was both timely and necessary to dedicate this first session especially to Iran. In recent months, Iran has faced a convergence of the internal and external pressure alongside ongoing special unrest and political contentions. The country has also experienced significant regional escalation. Most tragically, the massacre that took place in January recently has further intensified both domestic grievances and international concern, underscoring the human cost of the current crisis and the urgency of the informed and critical discussions. At the same time, these developments must be understood within the broader historical and political context. Since the 1979 revolution, Iran has undergone profound transformation, resulting in a political system that combines ideological governance with institutional control. Despite repeated waves of protest, including student movements, reform mobilizations, and the Women Life Freedom Movement in 2022, the system has demonstrated notable degrees of resilience. Today, Iran stands at a critical crossroad. The intersection of the internal dissent, regional tensions, and global geopolitical competition raises fundamental questions. Is the Islamic Republic entering a period of crisis? Does it retain the capacity for continuity and adaptation, or are we witnessing the early signs of the more transformative change? So before moving forward with this panel, I would like to invite my co-moderator, Dr. Stella Carpi, to introduce herself. Stella, please.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Encia, for the introduction. I'm Stella Carpi, an Associate Professor of Humanitarian and Migration Studies at University College London. And I just add that I'm glad and grateful that ECPR gives us this space to discuss such important matters. So as Encia mentioned, I'm just going to assist her to co-moderate this session. So I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Estella. So it's now time, my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers. First, we are honored to welcome Alan Eyre. Mr. Eyre is highly respected expert on Iran and a former U.S. diplomat. Notably, he was a member of the U.S. team involved in the nuclear negotiation with Iran, giving him direct insight into one of the most critical diplomatic processes shaping Iran's international relations. And good to know that Alan is the first ever Persian language spokesperson of the United States Department of State. We are also very pleased to have Arman Mahmoudian with us. Dr. Mahmoudian is a research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. His work focuses on Middle East and Russian affairs, and he brings extensive analytical expertise informed by both academic research and policy engagement. Let me also briefly outline the format for today's session. We will begin with Mr. Eyre, who will speak around 15 to 20 minutes, and he will be followed by Dr. Mahmoudian, who will offer his analysis and perspective. After both presentations, we will open the floor for discussion and questions. You are very welcome to share your questions throughout the session using the chat function, or if you prefer, you may raise your hand at the end of the session and ask your questions directly. In today's conversation, we aim to explore not only the origin of the evolution of the Islamic Republic, but also the dynamics that sustain it, the challenges it faces, and the possible scenarios for the future. We will also reflect on how these developments intersect with border question and regional stability, international politics, and also the role of the intellectual and maybe even the research community in that sense. With all of this, let's begin the session. So floor is yours, Eyre, and we will be really happy to have your thoughts about what's going on in the case of the Islamic Republic and what you are seeing about what's happening now in the region. Please.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a real honor. In terms of my own bona fides, as you said, I've been involved with Iran for most of my 40-year government career. I started following Iran in 1984. So over time, one can see certain dynamics. And you talk about how Iran is at a crossroads now. That's true, but it's always at a crossroads. So the regime is always changing. So I mean, what's happening right now is incredibly important, and we'll talk about that at length. But the longer historical trends are also interesting. If you look at the Islamic Republic of Iran since it started, one of the key dynamics is this ongoing shift to the right. To me, the most significant event in Iranian political history since 1979 was the 1997 election of President Khatami, who was the only Iranian diplomat after the revolution whose power or potential power stemmed from personal popularity as opposed to institutional affiliation. So this is back when Iran was still relatively young. At the time of the revolution, Iran's median age was around 18. It's now almost double that. So Iran has been aging throughout the course of the revolution. And the most significant dynamic involved with President Khatami was he was elected based on popularity, especially among young Iranians. But at that time, as we all know, the supreme leader was Ayatollah Khamenei, who, when he was first appointed after Khomeini died, was relatively powerless. But because of the nature of the position to which he was appointed supreme leader, lifetime position with massive political power accumulating to it, he gets to appoint key people. He has massive financial flows. So one of the other key dynamics of the revolution is just the agglomeration of power around one office and one person. Until he died recently, he was, primum inter pares, the single most important, most powerful person in the Islamic Republic. That certainly wasn't the case when he was appointed. He had been president for 8 years, whereas the true power at that time was with the prime minister, Mir Hossein Mousavi. When he became supreme leader, still, one could argue that Rafsanjani had more power and more control of the key institutions, but that changed over time to the point where before Rafsanjani died, he was relatively powerless, and Khamenei had was holding all the cards. So Khamenei, when Khatami got elected, was very concerned. He wasn't supposed to win. We all recall that the establishment's preferred president would have been Nateq Nouri, who was at that time the Speaker of the Majlis, but Khatami won in an upset. And then a couple of years after that, the sixth Majlis, which was the most reformist Iranian Majlis, was appointed, and the lead figure there was Khatami's brother. So at that point, the supreme leader used, what we call the entisabi positions, the appointed positions, as opposed to the entikhabi positions, the the ones we get elected by the people, using things like the Guardian Council, which both vetted legislation passed by the Majlis, and also, more importantly, vetted candidates who could run for office. And the Guardian Council, especially after Khatami got elected, used something called Nezarate Istisvolbi, which means appropriatory supervision, which basically said you have to prove, you have to demonstrate your fealty to the regime. It's not enough that you have no black marks, that you haven't been arrested or whatever. You have to show what's called, what's the word? I forget the Persian phrase, but eltizame amali, I think it was, um, demonstrated fealty to the regime. And so that's how the Nizam, the regime, controlled elections by controlling who could run and sometimes by manipulating the vote, which is how Ahmadinejad got reelected. But anyway, the point is that the key dynamic is this ever rightward shift of the Nizam, of the regime, and the neutering of what could be called the reformist party. Originally, there was no reformist party. There was the left, the Chapiha, the Rouhaniyun Mubarez, and the right, Rouhaniyat Mubarez. Those were the two political factions under the late Supreme Leader Khomeini, and he favored the leftists as a rule. But then he died, and the rightists became more and more powerful, and the Rouhaniyun became, after Khatami got elected, the reformists. But they've been progressively emasculated ever since the Khatami era. So to talk about, even though the president of Iran right now is a putative reformist, he has no power. The reformists have no power. I would argue that the elusive Iranian moderates have no power. And more, what's happened was you get a regime that's controlled by the military security elites. With the IRGC, the Islamic Republic Guard Corps, and the Beit Rahbari, which is the sort of the administrative exoskeleton that surrounds the Supreme Leader's office. And so, Western press loves to talk about people, who's up, who's down. Larijani is the most powerful person. He's dead. Now Ghalibaf is the most powerful person. That's not an optimal way to look at what's going on in Iran right now. Obviously, some people are more powerful than others, but the key reality, and we'll talk about this as time goes on, is just the institutions that control Iran. The growth of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, yeah, what did I say? Islamic Republic Guard Corps, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, um, happened at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, which was the single most significant strategic event for those running Iran right now, because the 8-year, well, they call it Difa-e Muqaddas, sacred defense, or what is it, Jang-e Tahmili, which is the imposed war, showed that Iran was on its own, that the rest of the world was seeking to overthrow the Islamic Republic, and that Iran had to stand for itself, which is why the late Ayatollah Khamenei did things like have Iqtisad-e Muqawamati, the resistance economy, which from an economic point of view makes no sense. But when you realize that your enemies are using what you need as a lever against you, it makes sense. Same thing with Jihad-e-Khud Kafai, the self-sufficiency jihad. Again, Iran wanted as much as possible to be as independent of the West and of other countries as possible, so they cannot be sanctioned and harmed. And again, economically makes no sense, but that's the way they did it. So after the 8-year war, Rafsanjani had to find something for the IRGC to do. It's much like, all the young Western men who returned to the economy after the Second World War, right? So during the war, the IRGC had been building a lot of things, construction companies, roads, dams. And so that's how they started their entry into economic fields. And that increased over time. And that's, again, a key dynamic of post-war Iran. The IRGC moves from being just a military power to an incredibly powerful economic entity. And that's where we are right now. Um, again, the IRGC is not a monolithic entity. It has factions within it also. And so, again, it's not necessarily the case that the commander of the IRGC is the most important person within the IRGC and he can control the IRGC and have it do whatever it wants. A lot of it is personalities. The way that the late Ayatollah Khamenei created things is he had parallel organizations that would fight for power, influence, control money, and then he would be the one who decides. And so, even within the IRGC, there were many different factions. We all know that before he was killed by the US, Qasem Soleimani was incredibly powerful, more powerful than just his title alone would indicate, because it all related to who was the supreme leader and the relations that person had with the supreme leader who appointed them all. So again, after the ceasefire in 1988, when Khomeini famously drank from the poison chalice, you have a couple of key dynamics: the progressive weakening of reformists or the left, and the increasing economic strength of the IRGC and just the security apparatus. This was also intensified by the fact that, as Iran started having these waves of protests, starting again with the Kuya Danishgah, with the Green Movement, with the succession of popular protests, leading up to December 28th of last year, Iran focused on being able to identify and suppress internal opposition. There's a great book by a gentleman called Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And he says, societies obviously are complex by nature, and they maintain their legitimacy by one of two ways: by providing essential goods and services to their people. They do a good job running the country. Where they fall short, they can use coercion, violence. And as Iran, which is relatively corrupt and relatively inefficient, became less and less able to provide essential goods and services to more and more of their people, they've doubled down on internal repression. And so Iran, as we saw, unfortunately, in January 8th and 9th, are really good and are quite willing to kill their own people, to suppress their own people. One of the reasons the Shah fell was because he was unwilling to spill Iranian blood. The current Iranian regime has no such compunction about that, right? They're happy to spill blood. Okay, so I want to now talk about how we got to where we are now, which is that Iran as a country, as a regime, had pillars of strategic deterrence. Its conventional military is very weak, right? The US has $1 trillion defense budget. Iran's budget, maybe it's about 20 billion. The problem was they had a what's called a TOE, a table of organization of equipment, based on Western goods because the Shah was buying every military system he could with the oil money he got. But then when we cut that off, they had to scramble. They have a pretty good defense industrial base now, but militarily, in terms of conventional military power, they're horrible, right? Their Air Force, again, this is before the war. Air Force is no good. Navy is rudimentary. Yeah, they got armed forces. They have two armed forces, the IRGC and the regular, but they're not that good at projecting power beyond their borders. So, as we all know, they had to focus on asymmetrical defense, right? And this was the forward defense doctrine, which is instead of fighting your enemies within your borders, you want to fight them as far away as possible. So Iran relied on three pillars for strategic deterrence: missiles, which are relatively cheap. A lot of countries help them with missile technology. Proxy network, and we all know all the various H's: Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, doesn't start with H, but the militias in Iraq. And also the nuclear program. And again, the benefit of the nuclear program was not that they have nuclear weapons, they don't. And, US intelligence had said that they had stopped seriously researching weaponization of a nuclear program around 2003 and hadn't resumed since then. They were a little freaked out by the Iraq war in 2003. But they had the essential prerequisite for a nuclear weapons program, which is they learned how to enrich. And here the United States screwed up massively. We tend to do this in terms of not dealing with a problem until it's right in your face. We waited until after Iran had mastered enrichment technology to deal with their nuclear program, which was a huge mistake. If you deal with a country before they learn to enrich, you're eliminating their capabilities. Once they learn how to enrich, all you can do is modify their intentions. Okay, so we waited too long to negotiate with Iran. We waited till after they had mastered centrifuge technology, thanks to AQ Khan and others. But we were able to get a perfectly fine nuclear deal with them, working hard from 2010 to 2015. We can talk about that if you want. But anyway, three pillars of Iran's strategic deterrence were all eliminated. The key event, again, causality goes all the way back to 14.6 billion years ago, right? But in terms of our discussion today, we could look at the October 7th Hamas attack as the start of a significant change in the Middle East. Because at that point, Israel said, this has to stop. Okay? We have to not just Israel was never this right-wing Israeli government was never big into negotiating with enemies. They preferred to eliminate them. So they moved against Gaza. They're trying to scoop up the West Bank. We're seeing what they're doing in Lebanon now. And the Netanyahu government made the same argument to President Trump that it had made to previous administrations, which is we have to get rid of the Islamic Republic. Israel sees Iran as an existential threat that cannot be negotiated with. So it weakened Iran's proxy network. Before the 12-day war, it took out its air defense. And then in the 12-day war, they dealt a serious blow to its nuclear infrastructure, to its missile infrastructure, to its air defense infrastructure. And now it was in a case where it had to mow the grass, right? Because Iran, having lost all three pillars of its deterrence, had to reconstitute that. They didn't try to reconstitute the nuclear program for a variety of reasons we can talk about, but they started trying to beef up their missile program. Netanyahu convinced the US, to participate in this latest war. And again, we can talk about the reasons why the US administration decided to do so, but we're in a situation now where Iran does not want to have to do this again 6 months from now, 8 months from now, a year from now, where Israel and the US decide to mow the grass because Iran is reconstituting its nuclear program or rebuilding its air defense and missile program. Even worse, Iran has now they've proved the case that by exercising control over the Strait of Hormuz, they can put significant pressure on the US and on the West. They had always threatened to do that, but the conventional wisdom was, well, Iran will never do that because it would hurt them also. They have to export their own oil. But as we're seeing right now, Iran can export its own oil while keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed. This is a new weapon Iran has. So Iran right now, and we've seen there's rumors of talks between the US and Iran that they might actually start at some point, but the uncomfortable reality is that before the war, the US and Iran were very far apart because the US had assumed that because Iran was weaker than ever, the US could impose a more maximalist set of demands on Iran and Iran would be forced to take it. Whereas, in fact, the opposite was true. Because Iran was so weak, it's less willing to capitulate because the operating Iranian strategic assumption is if you compromise under pressure, if you give in while you're facing pressure, it just invites further aggression. So Iran was less willing and able to negotiate with the US, even if the US were willing to negotiate with Iran in a good faith manner, which we weren't, because in their mind, Iran is just trying to topple the Islamic Republic, right? And if you show weakness, they'll come at you harder. And so any deal the United States and Iran could conceivably get now is going to be much, much harder and much worse for the United States because they're going to get less. because Iran is two reasons why it'll be worse. One, it's a much more hardline government. If Ayatollah Khamenei had died in his bed in peacetime, Mojtaba would not be supreme leader, right? For example, if we hadn't killed Ali Larijani, he would still be the head of the Supreme National Security Council. Now we've got Zulqadr, which again is the militarization of the key political institutions in Iran. This is something the US has brought about with this unnecessary and illegal war, and it's going to make dealing with Iran much harder in the future. I could go on ad nauseum, but I've talked for a long time, and I want to have my colleague speak because he's got very valuable insights that I'm eager to hear. So with that, I'll stop.
Thanks a lot.
Well,
Thank you very much, Alan. It was really great listening to your thoughts. For sure, we will come back to the questions that raised a lot in my mind as well. So now we move to Arman to hear about your thoughts also as well. Thank you.
well, thank you, NC and Stella, for inviting me and coordinating this panel. And it's a pleasure to be here with Alan. Thank you, Alan, for your kind feedbacks. I'm a great fan of Alan. I think Alan really, I can add to Alan's, analysis of Iran's contemporary politics and how we got there since the revolution. But I want to a little bit add to the background and also in a indirect way address why those who hoped Iran would experience what Venezuela experienced were kind of not really familiar with Iran's history. In early 19th centuries, Iran had a very interesting intellectual or Roshanfekh, open mind. His name was Ahmad Kasravi. He passed away in 1946. It's been reported that Ahmad Kasravi allegedly once said that we Iranian people, we owe the clergy a government. We are not certain that he said it or not, still it's reported, but it's part of the custom in Iran that whenever people have something to say, but they are afraid of social backlash, they kind of, make it other people's, property or comment. But it's been said. And if you look at the Iran's history and re-establishment of the Iran central government, a unified central government in early 15th centuries by Safavid Empire. Throughout there, until 1979, you would notice that their clergy is either to be trying to be part of the power or an opposing force to the power. For instance, in late 15th centuries, in 1586, we have Sheikh Bahai, who was the chancellor to Shah Abbas, the great Abbas, a great Safavid, a very powerful king. And then after that, we have the very same clergy opposing to the Nader Shah and getting badly beaten by the Afshari dynasty. And when you get to the closer, in 18th centuries and 19th centuries, the same thing is happening in Qajar dynasty. We either have figures like Mullah Ghasi, who had a clerical studies, who was a student of the Najaf Hoseh. He was a part of the power. He was a chancellor to Fath Ali Shah. And also we have others like Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri and Shirazi who opposed the Qajar dynasty. And then we have the Pahlavi dynasty, the last royal family. For the most of the Reza Shah's rule, the clergy initially tried, people like Modarres and, people like him tried to oppose him. Reza Shah was not a man who put up with the opposition, specifically speaking from the clergy, specifically speaking, again, for one of various reasons, including he truly believed clergy was one of the reasons that Iran was backward at the time. He may be right or wrong, but that's what he believed. And I think there is a good chunk of truth to it. And then we have Mohammad Reza Shah. Mohammad Reza Shah, when we look at, the US, the State Departments, when you look at the CIA documents, and also the political diaries of the many Iranians, he had an incomplete threat perception. To Mohammad Reza Shah, the primary threat was first foreign threat. It was a threat that he pursued for either Soviets or pro-friendly or friendly state Soviets in the Middle East, specifically speaking Iraq and earlier on Egypt. And when it comes to home, he was much more concerned about the Iranian Communist faction, the Tudeh party, and to some extent the nationalists, specifically speaking early 50s when Mossadegh came and he left. He saw clergy and Islamists on and off as a threat, but not as a strong as threat as the communists or the Soviet Union or the nationalists were. And it led him or resulted him to treat them a little bit different. And even to some extent, there was an idea in Iran that if we let the Islamists grow, they may to a turn to be a counterforce to the communists and also and others. And it takes us to 1977. Shah has been diagnosed with a blood cancer. He takes various unprecedented measures. Now we can tell what he takes that as measures, abolishing the one or two few parties that in Iran were allowed to operate, merging them all to one, the Rastakhis. And when he was faced by the opposition, he said that if you don't like it, you can get your passport and leave, and others. But now we can see that it wasn't only because he was overconfident with the oil. He was genuinely concerned about the succession, and there was a talk about unifying or paving the ground for the queen, the Farah Pahlavi be initiated.
I think we just lost the voice of Arman now.
Yeah, I can't hear him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's frozen. So let's see.
Porozit mikonen.
I don't know, they still have a power here as well. So, yeah, that's one of the challenges we have. I don't know, maybe we just wait a little bit to see that if Arman can reconnect again, join us.
I'll send him an email to make sure he knows.
No, he's back.
Yeah.
Oh.
You're back.
Yeah, Arman, you were talking about Farah Pahlavi and we just lost your voice. Okay, you can continue.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. You would think that the connection is good in a university, but it's really not. And Florida's weather doesn't help either. In 1977, for better or worse, to 1978, there is an atmosphere to Iran for many political factions to resurface. One of those people who resurface very quickly are the Islamists again, those who were around Ayatollah Khomeini. And there was various reasons. One of them was the charismatic character of the, Ayatollah Khomeini. He was a good speaker. I mean, I personally not the greatest fan of the guy, but he was, a good speaker. He was charismatic. He paid the price for his opposition. His son died in Iraq. Many in Iran at the time believed that his son Mustafa was killed by Sawak. It still is debatable, but that was a contemporary belief at the time. So, but there was other reasons behind of that too. The other reason was that clergy was known to be a political faction in Iran. And the third reason behind of that was the network they had. If you go through 1970s, among all political factions in Iran, Iranian clergy, the Rouhaniyat, has the largest social network in the country. Not even the government had that network. Look, you could go to a village. That village wouldn't have school, modern school, or a police station, or any government administration. But that village had one thing, and that was a mosque, a masjid. And all of these akhund and mullahs or clerics who were teaching at these masjids or working at that mosques, they used to go to one or two main clerical institutions, either in Iran or in Iraq. They knew each other. They were trained by mostly speaking the same pattern of stuff. So we have now in 1979 this type of people who for half a millennia were one way or another a part of the power taking over. And they are taking over while their leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, was 77 years old. Which brings us to the very core of the Iranian institutional planning.
Arman, you're frozen again.
We lost Arman again.
Sorry? Jesus. Can you hear me? I think I'm
Yeah,
here.
yeah, you were
Hello?
talking about, the power of Khomeini, and he was old when he got the power. Still, you are frozen.
Yes, still frozen.
Maybe if we all turn off our videos, it can be easier.
I don't know. It seems that there's a cyber attack in the Florida University by the regime of Iran. I don't know. Maybe they are aware. Hi, Arman. You're back again. You are muted.
Yeah, I switched my connection. Hopefully this works.
Okay,
So
good.
he was 77. The life expectancy of Iran was, according to National Institute of Health, 58 in late 1970s. So from the very beginning, the idea was that, well, this guy may not last for a while. And from day one, what they do is that when they establish the government, they also come with the position of deputy to the supreme leader, which we have Ayatollah Montazeri. And that position existed until there was a political dispute in early and mid 1980s, and they removed it. So that's first. The government was born, the regime was born out of the reality of that we may lose our supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, in such a chaotic time. We just took over, country is at the edge of the civil war, then is invaded. So we need to have a plan. And then there are other things happening in early 1980s. Is that Iran is in a war, but the Iranian politicians are keep dying. The prime minister gets killed. The minister of oil gets killed. The first ministry of defense gets killed, Chamran. The president gets killed. The main party of the government, the Jumhuriya Islami, the Islamic Republic Party, gets bombed. Shah Ali Mutari, the main or founding father of the Iranian ideology of the revolution, gets assassinated. So they were thinking that, well, now we're in war, and it seems that being a politician in this government is among the very risky jobs. But we need to also, it has a high fatality rate. We also need to maintain a coherent leadership during the war. So they come with the so-called National Defense Council, or the Supreme Council of National Defense, Shurای عالی دفاع ملی, which they recently reinstituted. And one thing they do is that they say that we need to provide a great deal of, or some level of autonomy to our commanders, that in terms of the paralyzation of the central high command, they can function and continue the holy defense or the sacred defense. Alan talked about it. So this is the first idea that comes, that the Iranian military, specifically speaking IRGC, needs to have, in a worst case scenario, a very, very well-defined plan B, an alternative plan. And then we have, toward the end of the war, then the IRGC, there is a question of the future of the IRGC, which Alan talked about it quite a lot. One thing that I want to add, during wartime, there was a kind of a dispute, not dispute, an argument, an intellectual argument inside the Iranian leadership that what we should do with this entity, IRGC, after war. Ayatollah Rafsanjani, who passed away questionably a couple of years ago, in his political diary, the Salhay Defa Muqaddas, or the years of the Holy War or Sacred Defense, he says that at some point there was an argument that after the war we are going to merge parts of the IRGC's units into the Artesh, the conventional military, and we will keep about 32 to 33 division as a political vanguard. Once the war ends, which brings us to Alan's point about the IRGC's contribution to the constructions. IRGC had a very large engineering corps. That engineering corps was a part of a body of another greater organization named the Jihad Sazandagi, or the Jihad of the construction. So they decide to use this for the reconstruction of the country. So Hashemi Rafsanjani is trying to bring it to the economy. But Ayatollah Khamenei, the now newly elected supreme leader, has a different idea. As a president, Ayatollah Khamenei, he was Iran's president from 1982 to 1989 when Ayatollah Khomeini dies. He suffered from being largely, I don't want to say emasculated, but outcasted as a power. They made the office of president quite ceremonial. And he did two things back then. He tried to kind of establish ties with the military people, which was quite unprecedented among the clergy. This is one thing about the clergy. The clergy really were not fond of, being associated with the military. Even Ayatollah Khomeini, he never really wanted to obtain the position of commander of the in-chief. He always, granted that autonomy to somebody else, initially to Bani Sad and later to Hashemi. Khamenei was different. He wanted to go he has a ties with the military people. He used to wear military uniform whenever he used to go to front lines. He barely was in a front line. He was always around it, but barely in it. He had that ties. And also, he got the chance to actually be present over one ministry, and that's a Ministry of Intelligence. Iran didn't have the Ministry of Intelligence for most of the first decade of the revolution. Toward the late 90s, they decide to form the new minister, and Khamenei plays a key role in it. So he had ties with military and intelligence apparatus. And once he becomes a supreme leader, he was young, 40 something, 47, I assume. He wasn't religiously really well known. He didn't have the main book. He turned to be an Ayatollah from a Hujjatul Islam within a couple hours. He was insecure about it. So he decides to say that, no, I really don't want to lose IRGC. And he tries to very quickly bring his own people to the IRGC, people who know him from the past. And he turns the IRGC actually to a political vanguard. Then within the 2 decades, IRGC grows as a parallel or a shadow government. If you look at the IRGC's organization throughout through early 2000, 2010, you would notice that they almost have a division and department for every single administrative part of the country. They have their economic department, they have their own foundations, they have their own legal department. So there is they have their own university, a shadow in the government, which brings us to 2026, the February 28th. And I think that's the issue why if the United States hoped for a Venezuelization of Iranian leadership, it didn't happen as quickly, is that they removed Ayatollah Khomeini, but they removed it from an administration that from the very get-go, 1979, the crisis of leadership, the possibility of leader may die in a chaotic time was a core identity. So for almost a half a century, Islamic Republic been around for 47 years now. They exercised this. And the June War, despite all the damages that it did to Iran, had one good thing for the Iranian regime. They realized that they need to rework on it. That's why they reinstituted the National Defense Council. That's why, according to the New York Times, Farnaz Fassi makes a great report in January 2026. She argues that after the war and the protests, when the Iranians started to anticipate another war, they began to defining or playing or demonstrating successor for every single high rank position up to 3 level. So they have a successor, they have a successor of the successor, and potential successor of successor. So they were building in. And that's why after the war, so far they hold up the power. It may change. I'm not Nostradamus. I don't know what happens a week from now. But to just point out, this is a regime that has been, from the very beginning, trying to work to not be a Venezuela. So hoping to reach a Venezuela kind of a victory, it doesn't seem the most realistic course of action, at least to me. I talk too much, and I apologize for the being kicked out twice.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arman. It was really great hearing about you, especially that you give us the really good background about what happened to Iran and why we ended up here, how the clerics get power, and then also fulfilling the ideals of the IRGC that Alan also mentioned explicitly about that. So you're just come back to the question. So I'm just asking the audiences, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and you can ask it directly, or you have anyone, please write in the chat and we will come back to that. So I just wanted to start with one idea that you mentioned, Arman, that the Islamic Republic already experienced in the times of the 60s, in the middle of the war, that many of the authorities of the regime have been killed or assassinated, or really mass people have been killed in even the bombard issue. But the point is that the regime survived even in the critical point of that, and even after that, the supreme leader passed away 1 year after the war, and they survived. And do you think that the same things is also happening right now, that many of the authorities of the regime have been assassinated, especially the supreme leader, but they are still surviving, which is a big question for many nations, that why the regime could survive even after the death of the supreme leader. And also the replacement of the supreme leader means that he's not alive or nobody have seen him yet.
Well, that's a very good question. I'm sure Alan has a better answer to give. But for my 2 pennies to share, it's kind of a yes and no, and I hate to do that. Look, historically speaking, we don't have any aerial campaign leads to regime change. I mean, I haven't seen it in history. If somebody else has seen it, I would be really appreciative if they tell me. But this is a really different case because also the level of the political removal is unprecedented, genuinely unprecedented. What would I say is that if the military campaign doesn't change, if there won't be a mass ground invasion or arming the Iranian body population to a grand level, I think the Islamic Republic would survive this war. My money is that they are going to survive it. But I think the Islamic Republic in a post-war era, and Alan mentioned that they have been, trying to consistently, the Islamic Republic was moving further and further toward the right. The post-Islamic Republic, the post-war Islamic Republic, in terms of political discourse and dynamic, it would be very different from the one prior to. First of all, Ayatollah Khamenei is not in the picture. He was the pillar of the regime. Second of all, the level of assassination in Iran has led to a generational change of management. I mean, 3 layers of the IRGC high command within a span of 7 months been killed. This is a generational change. And Iran's vulnerability is very different. So in a post-war, the Iran Islamic Republic would be different. In a good way or a bad way, I have no clue. They can try to be more politically strict, try to implement something similar to North Korea, not exactly like that, but even more harsher than that, to tighten the grasp of power. They can try to have a kind of, let's say that, a pragmatic, mostly military-backed government, like the Egypt case. They can have pursued the Chinese, version after the Mao. We've been told that Ali Larijani was interested in that option. It's very hard to verify it. But we do also know Ali Larijani played a key role in the massacre of the protesters in January. So which way is going to go, I don't know. But to sum up the answer, I think so far I believe the regime would survive the war. But in terms of political dynamic and discourse would be different. For better going to be for the people of Iran, for worse, or the international community, I don't know.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Arman. Can we have your thoughts also, Alan, about this?
About the possibility of regime change? What's the
No,
exact?
I'm just thinking about, because the regime survived all these assassinations in the 80s so far, and then many authorities have been killed at that time for many reasons. And we are also facing the same thing right now. Do you think that since they survived in the 80s during the war, they are also surviving the same thing right now? Is the same thing repeating or not?
Well, again, it's like the classic thinker, was it Herodotus, who said you can't stick your foot in the same river twice. The regime is always changing. Will it survive in some form? It is likely. Irrespective of Iran, just look at the base rate of changes in regimes globally. There's 193 countries, right? How often does a country jump disjunctively from one type of government to another? It doesn't happen that often. So irrespective of any characteristic peculiar to Iran, governments, regimes, nizams have staying power. When you look at Iran, what are the institutions that have the most power? IRGC and this Beit Rahbari, okay? Secondly, is there an organized and effective Iranian opposition? No, there is not. There are many, many brave, dedicated oppositionists both inside Iran and outside Iran. There is no organized, effective Iranian opposition that poses a credible alternative. Additionally, we are not seeing one of the essential prerequisites of some type of regime change, which is elite defection, right? You're not getting a lot of IRGC people going, I'm out of here, or not, following orders at the high level. So we haven't seen that yet. So again, this regime perhaps is approaching collapse asymptotically. It is certainly the case that when this war ends, they will be weaker in the sense of being less able to deliver essential goods and services to its people. It is probably the case that when this war is over, in the eternal dynamics of guns or butter, they will go for guns as opposed to butter. If you look at annual budgets, in the last couple of years of Iran, you will see more and more them, spending money on military, on security, on intelligence, less and less on what people need. Even before this latest war, the economy was a nightmare. It will only get worse. So unless Iran is able to get, as they are seeking, some type of reparations or sanctions relief, the economic situation is going to be much, much worse after this war, to say nothing of the enmity of the Gulf countries who they have been bombing since February 28th. So the regime will likely double up on repression, suppression, militarization. But at least in terms of the short term, it seems probable. And again, we're dealing with probabilities because this is a complex system and no one can predict. But it is probable that this regime will be around in its extremist hardline form, at least for the near term, possibly midterm.
So, thank you so much for your response, Alan and Arman. I would just like to give the floor right in CA, like we go by order, like just like asking our colleague Faber Hugo that raised the hand first if he wants to ask his question, Sulanya after that, and Hannah. And we also have a comment, no, a question in the chat, but it came later. So please just like in order.
All right. So first of all, thanks for a very great discussion so far. I'm Hugo Faber. I'm PhD candidate at Södertörn University in Stockholm. And I'm writing about energy security myself, so I'm following all of this very closely, of course. But my question is about what I think Alan mentioned in the beginning about the self-sufficiency of Iran. And I would like to ask you about the resilience of that self-sufficiency in light of the attacks, of course. So how self-sufficient is Iran in terms of the military, industrial complex, and also in terms of energy and food and other crucial sectors? And one last thing, does it matter if the Iranian oil exports are stopped or not? I mean, of course it matters, but how will it matter and how will it matter?
Well, no country is self-sufficient. Bani, I was thinking of that Saadi poem, Bani Adam Azay Yektigeren. Everyone's sort of part of the same tribe. So self-sufficiency is not practical. Iran needs stuff from other countries. Having said that, its defense industrial base is resilient and spread out, as is its nuclear program. And it's got a lot of energy. Now, the problem is they've subsidized their energy so ridiculously that they've really hurt themselves economically. If you look at price disparities for gasoline, for example, what it costs an Iranian to buy a liter of gas and what it costs someone in Pakistan or Afghanistan, the price differential is so great that massive amounts of gasoline are being smuggled outside of Iran to neighboring countries, and Iran actually has to import gasoline. Same thing to a lesser extent with their other forms of energy. One of the ways they've bought off, the public, and this is what happens in so many countries with a lot of fossil fuels, is that they've subsidized energy. They can't keep doing that because it's wasteful. Okay, so even though Iran has huge energy resources in terms of oil and gas, LNG, South Pars Field, it's over subsidized, but removing those subsidies, as we've seen in the past, has massive adverse political consequences. So Iran, is like so many of these countries with Dutch disease, has a huge natural advantage because of its petrochemical, because of its oil and gas resources, but it has squandered it. We won't even mention the massive corruption involved, because again, this will be the final point here. Apart from it, Iran is not an Islamic republic. It's an oligarchy, right? Much like many, if not most countries are oligarchies. There is a small elite economic class that is sucking wealth upwards from everyone else for their own personal enrichment. Not as bad as, for example, the United States, but still, it's an oligarchy. And those people who are benefiting the most and have the most to lose are in control. And their primary motivation is to preserve that. When Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, he actually wanted to spread Islam. He wasn't a nationalist. He didn't really care about Iran qua Iran, but he died. And right now, we have an Iran that's got essentially the same foreign policy that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would have if he were in charge with this same deck of cards, right? It wants to be the regional hegemon in the Gulf, and no one else wants that. That's my answer.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
So, Sulanya, you can go next.
Hi, thank you so much for this very insightful talk from both the speakers, and thank you to the organizers for this, especially for a layperson who's not an expert on Iran but has an interest in the region. This was very helpful. So my name is Sulagna Maitra, and I am a lecturer in humanitarian action in University College Dublin. And just based out of my subject interest, I had two questions. If you could permit me, you can choose to answer any one or neither. So one was from the civil society perspective and the civil society networks perspective, more not so much in terms of political resistance, because we have those, we hear about those, but more in terms of services and providing basic humanitarian kind of thing. So what is your impression or idea? Because we don't tend to hear a lot about that what are the civilian networks, if any, because there seem, we from the outside, we seem to hear about two things quite separately. One is the diaspora, and that is mostly in terms of political resistance and who is going and influencing the political protests. And again, within the inside Iran, again, it is more in terms of political. So I was wondering, what is, in your opinion, the scene in terms of civil society networks for providing services and basic human this thing? And is there any connections to Eastern Europe? Is there any civil society solidarity networks with Eastern Europe, Russia, given the historical connections? And the second thing is more strategic, probably, that now we see in Chinese foreign policy kind of this move towards development and humanitarian aid. It's coming up more and more. And I was wondering, does that mark some kind of a shift? Because we are not hearing so much about Russia, and part of me wonders if that is because of US-Russia relations are somewhat different under this current regime. So I was wondering if there is any shift from Iran's geostrategic and strategic partnership perspective between, like in terms of its relations with Russia and China. Thank you.
Arman, شما بفرمایید.
Okay, I start with the second question. I check the Chinese and let's say the Chinese and Russians, policy toward the current state of the Iran. Honestly, I think the China and Russia, they reacted to the whole matter as it was expected. I mean, unless one was a member of the group that found Iranian relationship with Chinese or Russian an alliance, which never been a case. But no, the Chinese and Russians' reaction to the war is exactly as it was expected, business as usual. Neither of the countries have ever any desire to get into a direct conflict with the United States or Israel over Iran, various reasons. For the Russians, started off, the war itself is not really bad for the Russia. We do know there is a talks of, at least easing the sanctions on Russia's oil and energy, gas, energy temporary. And usually these things start temporary and then we haven't get there, but there is a talk, and at least we can say that the talk is appeasing to Mr. Putin. The second thing that people are, gets less touched rather in compared to the energy matter is a matter of munition. Ukrainian air defense to some extent, not wholly, uses the same munition that the US, Arab states, and Israel are using in the kind of war. So it's the danger of the exhaustion. The third is the diversion of that attention. You don't hear much about Ukraine right now in US media outlets. Or you hear about Iran a lot. So that diversion, one can say that, well, military and intelligence services, they have different sections. The Russia section does its job. It does, but the diversion provides a momentum for those politicians and members of the administration who are seeking detente with Russia, even at the cost of Ukrainian territorial integrity. And in this administration, there's plenty of them. So on that level, war, as long as doesn't result in the collapse of regime in Iran, is not a bad thing for Russia. If it results in the collapse of regime, that can be a different scenario, depending on who comes. So far, we are not there. And Russia has a different type of relationship with Arab states and Israel. Russia's relationship with Israel actually relatively very close. The Russian language is the third largest language in Israel, next to Arabic and Hebrew. Many Israelis are coming from the former Soviet Union. They have ties with Russia. Right now, in the country of Russia, about 100,000 people live with dual citizenship, one being the Israeli citizenship. Russia also has a really good relationship with Arab states, militarily and over oil and gas. I mean, while they are competitor, but in past Arab states, in specifically speaking Saudi Arabia, within the concept of the OPEC Plus and similar platforms, they try to modify the gap of production in a way that also suits the Russia's interests, and Russia really doesn't want to jeopardize that. So they are not planning to get involved. They may share intel. I don't know to what extent they are do. I don't know to what extent it is works, but nothing beyond that. Chinese are the same. Chinese been quite, I think to give the Chinese a credit, they've been quite frank that they are going to be a partner or friend of you during the stable days. If there is instability, nothing much should be expected from them. And when there is post-instability era, they are more than happy to chip in for the constructions. So I don't think so that they will want to change that direction. They may even want to pressure Iran. Chinese are very much sensitive over the oil price. They are not really happy with this. Yesterday, I read a report says that while in the global market, they say that the price of one barrel of oil is 110, some Asian markets actually began to trading it for 150. This is not a good news for the Chinese, and I understand they get a fairly well discounted oil and gas from the Russia. Some reports suggest they get 25 to 33% of discount. But the Chinese are also not interested to put all of their energy eggs into the Russian basket for various reasons. They want diversification. So right now, to sum up your answer, I don't see any prospect of either Russians or Chinese change or modify their current, at least not direct backing or interventionist policy to Iran in a shorter span of time. But I leave the Alan to answer, to kind of correct that or not, and also answer the first question.
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, the Iranian civil society is amazing. It always has been. I mean, I said earlier there's no political organized internal opposition, but the various networks dealing with various issues, everything from, the massive water shortage in Iran, environmental issues. I don't need to talk about the Iranian artistic community. I have always been very impressed by the vitality of Iranian civil society. I can't speak to its affiliations with Eastern Europe, though. But yeah, I mean, again, people are people. I'm not saying the Iranian people are more resourceful, more intelligent, or, different than people anywhere else. But Iranian civil society has always impressed me tremendously.
Thank you so much.
For your question, Hanno, you can go next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Hanno Scholz, a sociologist and political scientist from the University of Zurich. First of all, thank you very much as well for this insightful information. For discussing crisis continuity and transformative change, as the title goes, I would like to go a little bit deeper into the opposition. Because transformative change would indeed only be possible if the opposition would be able to unite, and there seems not to be any shared mechanism to coordinate among groups or to build shared legitimacy or overcome the tensions between the different camps. Are there actors who are interested, who see this as a key bottleneck in unifying, and who would be willing to work on an institutional umbrella that unifies the opposition, not just a person as is promoted by the monarchist camp?
I could start, and then Arman, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. Every time I hear the phrase Iranian opposition, I think of the famous sentence by Bertrand Russell, "The present king of France is bald." Okay? There is no Iranian opposition. So talking about it, to my mind, epistemologically, ontologically, is a waste of time. Okay? There could be it. Certainly, when the people poured out in the streets in December 28th, we saw anger. Anger isn't enough. You have to have organization. And we've all read, Gene Sharp and the other theoreticians. We know about what it takes to topple a regime. As I said earlier, I'm not denigrating oppositionists. I have tremendous respect for everyone inside Iran and outside Iran who are fighting for change. But the unfortunate reality of the Iranian diaspora is that they're more busy fighting each other than building an organization that's effective inside Iran. So, and unfortunately, I think this latest war has made their job much harder. If you look at the incidents of demonstrations in Iran over the last 20 years, it's clear that they're happening more frequently, despite the lack of organization, as the regime is less and less able to deliver essential goods and services to more and more people. So had we not attacked, I was relatively confident that given enough time, you could see more and more internal pressure and perhaps a more and more organized internal opposition. But let's not forget, in 1979, unions were striking. People were walking off work. You had this alliance between the bazaar and the clergy that funded opposition. You don't have any of that now. Okay? You have a lot of angry Iranians, brave Iranians, many of whom take to the streets. So one of the many unfortunate consequences of this war, I think, is retarding or delaying effective organized opposition inside Iran. But as always, eager to hear what Arman has to say.
Thank you, Alan. I know, honestly, you're right on money. And Teda Skocpol, who dedicated her life into the studying revolutionary, once said that there needs to be a cross-coalition alliance in order to topple a regime. You mentioned the merchants, the bazaris, the clergies, and the scholars. We don't have it in Iran, and we don't have a opposition. And I doubt that the groups that right now in this uproar they are active with, they can ever be unified. I think there are three reasons behind of that. The first one is I don't want to criticize them necessarily, but the totalitarian way of behavior among them. Each of them, the monarchists, the non-monarchists, they have a very strong, great deal of desire to not only project themselves as the primarily one, but also get the credit of whatever happens. The second thing has something to do with the Islamic Republic. Islamic Republic did a good job on one thing, and that was suppressing any active, organized political movement inside of the government, inside Iran. And this is something that wasn't the case in 1970s. In 1979, 1978, when the revolution was happening, Ayatollah Khomeini himself was in France in exile, but he had giants inside Iran. Taleghani, Mutahari, Hashemi Rafsanjani, Montazeri. The key men were in Iran. You don't hear anybody in that level from the Reza Pahlavi, from the Masih Ali Nejad, from all over the groups outside of the country, inside the country. They don't have any. And the third is, I think, a paranoia that Iranian political groups are suffering to some extent rightfully. And that's because what happened in 1979 revolution. Look, in 1979 revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini was a primary figure. I have no doubt about that. And I don't think it's fair to doubt about that. It doesn't make him morally right or wrong person, but he was a primary figure. But many different factions stand behind him. The Nationalist Front, the National Front, the Unified National Front, even some communist elements, other Islamist movement, ethnic groups, they decided for at least to topple the Shah. They stay behind of him. They kind of forego or prevent any political dispute publicly. And they hope that after revolution, it would be rewarded. What Ayatollah Khomeini did right after, a day after revolution, he actually trained the government. He cut anybody who was out of his political sphere. It started with the Nehzat Azadi, the National Front, the Communists, the MLK. Everybody was cut out. And I think it created a sense of trauma and paranoia in Iranian political activities. That we are not going to do the same mistake. We are not going to stand unified among any other figure. We are not going to raise another Khomeini in order, because we don't want to experience what others experienced in 1980s. We don't want to get cut out, butchered. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but there is a difference being not to stand behind the same figure and being at each other 27. And I think that's the main problem with Islamic Iranian political activists. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Very helpful.
So we will soon get to Sulagna's follow-up question, but there was like someone first, right? Nico Minde, yes, please.
So thank you very much once again, and those are good thoughts. My name is Nico Minde. I'm from Kenya in East Africa, and I teach international relations at the American University. In addition to the question that I've asked about the futures of Iran with the new supreme leader, I wanted also to understand and underscore, for example, because we're talking about the crisis, the crossroads of Iran and continuities. But this war, don't you think, also has exposed the lack of understanding of Iranian political structure and system, especially from the West, that is the United States and Israel? And I'm also trying to understand how Iranian leadership will be shaped beyond, especially after, because we know there's the Netanyahu factor in Israel and Donald Trump in the United States, and all of them are facing elections in the not too distant future. How do you see that influencing or impacting Iranian transitions beyond the war in the next few years? Thank you very much.
Arman, why don't you go first and I'll clean up after
You
you.
go first. Yeah, I think it's good. It's best for you to, yeah.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, one of the few consistent themes since the Islamic Republic started in 1979 has been U.S. enmity and hostility, right? So, the Republicans and the Democrats don't agree on anything, as you can see just by looking at the papers. But the one thing that all of them agree on is that Iran is an enemy. Okay? Part of that is for domestic political reasons. Part of that is because Iran is a rejectionist power. Part of it is because those people running the U.S. now were traumatized in 1979 when the Iranians broke into our embassy, seized our hostages, and for 444 days, there was nothing we could do about it, right? So personal trauma, mutually incompatible strategy. And again, you're not going to see any congressperson stand up, Republican, Democrat, Senate or House, and go, yeah, I think we should be nicer to Iran. Okay? So there's a lot of reasons, to say nothing about the fact that U.S. defense industry, the military industrial complex, has made billions and billions of dollars selling U.S. weaponry to the GCC countries. So there's a whole lot of institutional reasons why this status quo will continue. Also, in Iran, the IRGC is getting rich from sanctions, from being a closed off economy, from being able to play with different exchange rates. In terms of Israel, the only country where this war is popular, massively popular, is Israel. So again, in Israel, Netanyahu was under a lot of pressure for corruption, for the fact that the Israel security establishment, bungled October 7th, didn't see it coming. This war is a godsend to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to the right-wing government. They're moving into Lebanon. No one's, fewer people are talking about what Israel's doing in West Bank and Gaza. So, things are the way they are for a reason. And even though it's theoretically possible to have a new and essentially different relationship between Iran and the United States, the forces aligned against that are massive. Arman, بفرمایید.
No, Alan is a veteran diplomat. He was actually in the very core of the Iran nuclear negotiation from 2011 to 15, the JCPOA. So I think he's the best person to ask about the. But just to add it, on Iranian front, it's been reported Hashemi Rafsanjani toward the end of Ayatollah Khomeini's life in late 1980s genuinely pressured Khomeini to resolve the matter with America. And he made an argument that if you don't resolve this, if you don't show a willingness to detente, it's going to be very hard for your successor to do so. And Khomeini rejected it for various reasons. One of the reasons that been said is that for Khomeini, drinking one cup of poison, which was ending the war, was enough. And he died a year later. So 20 truly was a poison for him. And then Ayatollah Khamenei came. And it was a very complicated, first years for him. It seems actually he didn't really, to the core, oppose the detente, but he wanted to maintain a revolutionary figure. So for his own political interests, he prevented it. And then the reformist kings, Khatami wants to talk with the Clinton. Khamenei was insecure. He didn't like the reformists be in touch with the Americans, so he postpones the detente and goes on and goes on and goes on. So there is a political problem in Iran, which being kind of combined by material incentive. Many people in Iran, many of those who are in power, they are benefiting, or they were benefiting through the hostility or from the hostility with the United States. And Alan mentioned the IRGC people. And it's not us saying, it's actually Iran's former president, President Ahmadinejad. Despite all of his controversial remarks and character, one time during his presidential time, it is second time, he called the IRGC commanders Barodaran Qachakhchi, which means in English the smuggler brothers, or our brothers who are smuggling. And why he said that, there was a point behind that. It was because the IRGC was infamous to bring products and goods who are sanctioned to be exported to Iran, to bring them in Iran, bypass the sanctions and profit from there heavily. So they were benefiting from the sanctions, really and practically, and in practice they were benefiting. And this war, I don't know to what extent is gonna, impact of it. If Mojtaba Khamenei is alive, if he is to survive this war, and if he is to run Iran truly after the war, there are so many ifs. So then we will have in charge in Iran a person who lost his father, his wife, his children, his sister-in-law, sister, brother-in-law, and nephew. Well, and he already been famous for being very radical. So you add this personal vendetta to the reports about his political characterization. I don't see much of a good out of it for the Iranian-American relationship. But as I said, there are three ifs. And it's very too soon to predict who will really make the glass shot or glass call in Iran in post-war era. That was a good question.
So I would just like read Sulagna's follow-up question on this war unifying or not the different madhahib like Islamic sects like Sunnis and Shias. Is this a credible claim or not?
Yeah.
And then we will quickly get to Faber if we manage. And also in Sia, you had a question as well, and we can wrap up after that.
The question is whether this war will unify Islamic sects. Is that it?
Yes.
I mean, maybe second or third order. One of the things about a war is that most of the important consequences are unpredictable. The second and third order effects, we can all talk about the first order effects. I'm actually far more concerned about Iran becoming a near failed state and the repercussions that would have in terms of, for example, the Kurds, the Baluch. We know that Israel was trying to agitate the Kurds to mount some sort of insurrection in Western Iran. 5 Kurdish groups united. We know that a lot of Gulf countries tend to fund Baluchi separatists who are, Sunni Muslims in the poorest part of Iran, which is Iranian Baluchistan. So I mean, certainly the destabilizing consequences of an Iran that's unable to exercise internal control, which is the Israeli war goal, are manifold and unpredictable. But short of that, if the Iranian regime maintains control, yeah, the empowering of Iranian of Muslim sects is really not on my short list of things I worry about most.
Well, yeah, I'd say, yeah, I agree with the point, Alan. And honestly, I don't think so that I don't know how the war itself is going to unify different Islam sectors because we have a war that the primarily Shia power in the world is bombing every single Sunni neighbor. So, I mean, they even bomb Oman, which is still hard to figure out. So, I mean, they have one friend in the Gulf, a true friend. That was Oman. Oman is historically been a good friend to Iran since Shah to now. And they bombed, they came to the conclusion to bomb them. So I don't know. And we also have Hezbollah's activity in Lebanon. For so many Lebanese, Christian and Sunnis, Hezbollah is dragging Lebanon to a war that might lose a good chunk of its territorial integrity and might cause a great deal of instability for the country, solely for the sake of its own survival as a Shia entity. Because for Hezbollah's idea is that if the Iran goes, we are just next. Or out of ideological alignment with the Iran. Either of these two doesn't sit well with you if you're a Sunni Lebanese or Christian Sunni Lebanese. It's just selfish. So I don't know. At this point, I don't think that the war causes a grand unification among Islamic Ummah. But we will see. Again, as Alan said, that it's very, very, very soon to say that. But we have, so far we have to see the state of Iran after the war.
Thanks for your responses. So, Faber, if you can please keep your question quite short so that NCA can ask hers before we wrap.
Absolutely. So I just wonder, because the European response has, of course, been pathetic, but what would you like to see Europe and China and the rest of the world do? What could they do in this situation?
Alan, you're a diplomat.
Yeah, again, it's a peculiarly American misconception to think that every problem has a solution. Okay? There is very little the Europeans can do, the Chinese can do, the Russians can do to unbreak this vase. Okay? The basic reality is that the US and Israel want this, Iran wants this, and there's no intersection set. The US doesn't need doesn't need other countries' military might necessarily, even though President Trump did ask for help to open the Strait of Hormuz, which is, at least in the short term, is impossible. Okay? But the Aslamat Lab, the root of this is you gotta put Iran, the US in a room, lock the door, and just keep them there. That won't necessarily bring about a solution, but it's the best chance.
Uh, yeah, that's true. And just to add to a note, Alan mentioned about the President Trump's request to help to the European Union, and many now criticize the European Union why you are not involved. I found the whole notion very interesting that asking Europe to be involved in a war that they were not aware of the starting of it, and only a couple months after the United States actually claimed made a territorial claim against another European country. I mean, this war happened 3 months after US asking for the Greenland to be handed over. So, and the European didn't took it well. So it's going to be very hard for the United States to kind of bring Europe on board to the extent that it wants. The European has, stakes in that matter. They want this war to be resolved. The Chancellor of the Germany just said it earlier again to them, I think for the fifth time, that the war wants to be over. But the Europe is also in a strange position. And what Alan said is that, that all they can do is just forcing a mediation between these two powers. But that would require political willingness from both Iranian and American end. And as Alan mentioned, no one else has much of a saying in it but themselves.
So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Estella, for that. I know that we are really getting out of the time, but as an Iranian, I really have a personal question that I really want to end it up that because we didn't have a time to go in the details that why US, started the war, company with Israel. But I just wanted to mention that the President Trump mentioned several times that human rights issues also was involved. The Iranians has killed 30,000 people. I'm just wondering that. Is that really realistic to thinking that the administration of the Trump is really thinking about the human rights issue because they already mentioned that we destroyed all the nuclear facilities of the Iran in the 12 days war. Is that was the reason of the just only nuclear issues, or should Iranians be saying that okay, they are demanding for the help and it happens? Is that really realistic issue to really think about that, or human rights is completely out of the vision of the US administration for helping the Iranians regarding what's happening inside of the Iran? Thank you.
Human rights are totally outside the US administration's reasoning for this war. The US administration does not care about the Iranian people's human rights to any significant degree. Arman, your turn.
No, I don't think so. It was among our top political priority. I mean, if you even look at the President Trump's statement at the early days of the war, there wasn't not mention of much of a mentioning of the human rights or protest of the January. It was very much narrowed. We don't want them to have bomb, and then there was a regime change. But they kept saying that we want a regime that if there was regime, we want a regime that we can work with it. I don't think so. I think it was an incentive to the United States in a sense that I think the protests in January made a signal to many outside that the Islamic Republic is very close to the prospect of the collapse. At least that's the way that many found it. And they found that, well, maybe it's a good opportunity. Maybe this is the time to topple the regime. And when you look at the Israelis at this political rhetoric, Prime Minister Netanyahu been very, very blunt about that, very bold about that in stating this. But was it the reason? No, I doubt that. I very much doubt that throughout history there are much of a, wars over humanitarian intervention. There are one or two here or there, but no, I don't think so. This one was because of the people of Iran. No, this was a getting even for half a century of hostility and other political and interests. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much. If you have the final words to add regarding whatever you want, we will be really happy to hear that in 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan, do you want to wrap up with one sentence?
Yeah, this was an illegal, ill thought out of war against Iran. Iran is a horrible regime. I'm certainly not whitewashing what they're doing. I'm certainly not a fan of the Islamic Republic, but if the US was trying to achieve strategic goals with this attack, it has failed. And the best thing the US can do is just stop.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, I think this war has a great deal of potentiality to enter Iran in a new era. And to be honest, I'm not sure that's necessarily promising. This war has brought Iran to the age of either falling into a total, having the great deal of possibility of being run by the military dictatorship and total IRGC takeover, or almost being a failed state. And given the Iran's neighborhood, Iran's demography, and the state of Iran's neighbors, if Iran will be in a failed state, it won't be definitely good for Iran. It also wouldn't be good for the international security and regional order. That is going to have a triple consequences beyond the Iranian border.